In December 1941, the Dutch East Indies was one of the wealthiest colonial possessions in the world. Spanning thousands of islands across Southeast Asia, modern-day Indonesia, it produced rubber, oil, tin, and spices that enriched the Netherlands for over 3 centuries. The Dutch had built schools, roads, and cities. They'd created a colonial administration employing thousands. They believed their empire would last forever. Then, in just 3 months, it was gone. This is the story of how World War II destroyed the Dutch Empire and how a colonial power learned, too late, that empires built on exploitation cannot survive the modern age. The Dutch arrived in Southeast Asia in the late 16th century, driven by the spice trade. Nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were worth their weight in gold in European markets. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, established trading posts, then forts, then colonies. By the 17th century, the VOC was the world's most powerful corporation, with its own army, navy, and the authority to wage war and sign treaties. The VOC ruled through a combination of trade monopolies, military force, and alliances with local rulers. When local kingdoms resisted, the Dutch crushed them. The VOC's conquest of the Banda Islands in the 1620s was particularly brutal. They massacred or enslaved most of the indigenous population to secure a monopoly on nutmeg. This set the pattern for Dutch colonial rule: profit through control, maintained by violence when necessary. By the 19th century, the VOC had dissolved, but the Dutch government took direct control of the Indies. The colonial administration introduced the cult of cultivation system, forcing Javanese farmers to grow export crops like sugar, coffee, and indigo instead of food. The system generated enormous profits for the Netherlands, but caused famines that killed hundreds of thousands of Indonesians. Dutch wealth was built on Indonesian suffering. Yet, the Dutch also developed the Indies economically. They built railroads, harbors, and telegraph systems. They established schools, though education was limited, and designed to create a class of Indonesian clerks and administrators, subordinate to Dutch rulers. A small Indonesian elite learned Dutch language and culture, studied in Dutch schools, and began absorbing ideas about nationalism, democracy, and self-determination. By the 1920s, Indonesian nationalism was growing. Educated Indonesians looked at other colonized peoples, Indians under British rule, Vietnamese under French rule, and saw growing independence movements. They asked why Indonesia should remain a Dutch possession. Organizations like the Indonesian Nationalist Party, led by a young engineer named Sukarno, demanded independence. The Dutch responded with repression, arresting nationalist leaders and banning political organizations. The Dutch believed they had time. They thought they could manage Indonesian nationalism through limited reforms, a little more education here, a few more Indonesians in lower administrative posts there. They believed the Indies needed Dutch guidance and would remain Dutch for generations. They were catastrophically wrong. What they didn't anticipate was that their empire would be destroyed not by Indonesian revolutionaries, but by an outside invader, Imperial Japan. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, the Netherlands quickly fell to Nazi Germany. The Dutch government fled to London, but the East Indies remained under Dutch control, governed from Batavia, modern Jakarta, by colonial administrators. The Indies suddenly became vital to the Allied war effort. It produced oil that Japan desperately needed for its war machine. Britain and America urged the Dutch to impose oil embargoes on Japan, cutting off this crucial supply. Japan faced a strategic dilemma. Its war in China was consuming vast resources. American embargoes had cut off oil, steel, and other materials essential for modern warfare. Japanese military planners looked south to Southeast Asia, to British Malaya, French Indochina, the American Philippines, and especially the Dutch East Indies. These territories held the resources Japan needed, but seizing them meant war with the Western powers. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, crippling the American Pacific Fleet. Simultaneously, Japanese forces invaded British Malaya and the Philippines. The Dutch East Indies was next on the target list. The colonial government mobilized its defenses, but they were pitifully inadequate. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army had about 140,000 troops, mostly Indonesian soldiers led by Dutch officers, spread across thousands of islands. The colonial air force had obsolete aircraft. The Navy had a few cruisers and destroyers, no match for Japanese carrier strike forces. In January 1942, Japanese forces invaded the Indies from multiple directions. Paratroopers seized key oil fields in Sumatra and Borneo. Amphibious forces landed on Celebes and the Moluccas. The colonial forces fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by superior numbers, better equipment, and Japanese air superiority. Dutch commanders had planned for a long defensive campaign, holding out until American and British reinforcements arrived. Those reinforcements never came. The Battle of the Java Sea in late February 1942 was the decisive engagement. A combined Allied fleet, Dutch, British, American, and Australian, warships tried to stop a Japanese invasion convoy heading for Java. The battle was a disaster. Japanese torpedoes and naval gunfire devastated the Allied fleet. 5 Allied warships were sunk, including the Dutch flagship. The Japanese convoy reached Java unopposed. On March 8, 1942, the Dutch commander in the Indies, General Hein ter Poorten, surrendered. In just 3 months, Japan had conquered the entire Dutch East Indies. Over 100,000 Dutch soldiers, civilians, and Indonesian colonial troops became prisoners of war. The Dutch flag came down across the archipelago. 3.5 centuries of Dutch rule ended almost overnight. For the Dutch, the loss was traumatic. The Indies had been their pride and profit for generations. Dutch identity was tied to their role as colonial masters. Suddenly, that identity was shattered. Tens of thousands of Dutch civilians, men, women, and children, were interned in brutal Japanese prison camps. Thousands died of starvation, disease, and mistreatment. The Japanese treated European prisoners with particular cruelty, seeking to destroy white prestige in Asian eyes. But Japan's occupation wasn't just about defeating the Dutch. It was about reshaping Asia. Japanese propaganda proclaimed a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, promising to liberate Asians from Western imperialism. This was largely hypocrisy. Japanese rule was often more brutal than Dutch rule had been. But the propaganda had an effect. The Japanese released nationalist leaders, like Sukarno, from Dutch prisons and allowed them to organize politically, hoping to use Indonesian nationalism against any Allied return. Sukarno and other nationalists faced a difficult choice. They hated Dutch colonialism and saw Japanese occupation as an opportunity. But they also recognized that Japanese rule was simply replacing one empire with another. Sukarno chose collaboration, working with the Japanese while preparing for eventual independence. He gave speeches supporting Japan's war effort, but privately, he and other nationalists were building the organizations and networks that would form an independent Indonesian state. The Japanese occupation was devastating for ordinary Indonesians. Japan needed resources for its war effort: food, oil, rubber, labor. They implemented forced labor systems that were even more brutal than Dutch colonialism. Hundreds of thousands of Indonesians were conscripted as laborers, working on military projects under horrific conditions. Tens of thousands died. Famine spread as Japanese authorities requisitioned rice, leaving local populations to starve. The occupation killed more Indonesians than 3 centuries of Dutch rule. Yet the occupation also transformed Indonesian consciousness. For the first time in centuries, Indonesians saw white colonial rulers defeated and humiliated. European prestige, carefully cultivated over generations, evaporated. Japanese propaganda, despite its hypocrisy, introduced ideas of Asian solidarity and anti-colonial resistance to mass audiences. The Japanese organized youth groups, trained Indonesian administrators, and even created an Indonesian auxiliary army. These institutions would become the foundation of the independence movement. By 1945, Japan was losing the war. American forces were advancing across the Pacific. Allied bombs fell on Japanese-held cities across Asia. In August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15. For the Dutch, this should have been a moment of triumph. They could now reclaim their empire. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. Just 2 days after Japan's surrender, on August 17, 1945, Sukarno and fellow nationalist Muhammad Hatta declared Indonesian independence. They proclaimed the Republic of Indonesia, with Sukarno as president. The declaration was brief but momentous. Indonesia was now an independent nation. Indonesians across the archipelago celebrated. They raised the red and white flag, sang the new national anthem, and prepared to defend their freedom. The Dutch were stunned and furious. They'd endured 5 years of occupation, imprisonment, and suffering, believing they would return to their colonial paradise. Now, Indonesians were claiming independence? The Dutch government refused to recognize the republic. They prepared to retake the Indies by force, confident that Indonesian nationalism was a minority movement that would collapse once Dutch authority returned. But the world had changed. The United States and Britain were now the dominant powers, and both were increasingly skeptical of colonialism. President Roosevelt had been openly anti-colonial. His successor, Harry Truman, was less ideological but still reluctant to support European empires. Britain was exhausted by war and preparing to grant independence to India, Pakistan, and Burma. The colonial world order was collapsing, but the Dutch didn't see it. In late 1945 and 1946, British forces temporarily occupied Indonesia to disarm Japanese troops and repatriate prisoners of war. They found themselves caught between Dutch demands to restore colonial rule and Indonesian determination to remain independent. Clashes broke out between British troops and Indonesian fighters. The Battle of Surabaya in November 1945 saw Indonesian militias fight British and British Indian forces for weeks. Thousands died, but Indonesian resistance proved this wasn't a minor rebellion, it was a national revolution. When the Dutch troops finally returned in large numbers in 1946, they expected to restore order quickly. Instead, they faced a full-scale guerrilla war. Indonesian fighters, including former Japanese-trained auxiliaries, nationalist youth groups, and even Islamic militias, attacked Dutch positions, ambushed convoys, and assassinated collaborators. The Dutch controlled cities and main roads, but the countryside belonged to the Republic. The Dutch launched 2 major military offensives in 1947 and 1948, trying to crush the Republic. They called them police actions, refusing to acknowledge they were waging a war. Both offensives captured territory and pushed Republican forces into defensive positions. The Dutch army was better equipped and trained, but they couldn't win. For every Indonesian fighter killed, more joined the resistance. The population supported independence, and international pressure was mounting against Dutch colonialism. The United States, now emerging as the dominant Western power, wanted the conflict resolved. America needed allies in the Cold War against Soviet communism. Indonesia, with its large population and strategic location, was too important to alienate. The U.S. threatened to cut off Marshall Plan aid to the Netherlands unless they negotiated seriously with the Republic. Britain, bankrupt after World War II and granting independence to India, Pakistan, and Burma, urged the Dutch to accept reality. At the United Nations, the Indonesian question became a major issue. Asian and Arab nations supported Indonesian independence. Even Australia, once supportive of Dutch colonialism, shifted toward recognizing the Republic. The Dutch found themselves isolated diplomatically. Their propaganda about bringing civilization and order to Indonesia rang hollow after Indonesians demonstrated they could govern themselves. The Dutch military situation was also deteriorating. The war was expensive, costing millions of guilders the Netherlands couldn't afford. Dutch casualties mounted. Young Dutch conscripts were dying in a colonial war most Dutch citizens didn't understand or support. At home, opposition to the war grew. Progressive political parties questioned why the Netherlands was fighting to maintain an empire when it should be rebuilding from Nazi occupation. In December 1948, the Dutch launched their second police action, capturing the Republican capital of Yogyakarta and arresting Sukarno and other leaders. The Dutch believed they'd won. The Republic's government was destroyed, its army scattered. But they'd only succeeded in making the Republic a martyr. Guerrilla resistance intensified. International condemnation was fierce. The UN Security Council demanded a ceasefire and Indonesian independence. By 1949, the Dutch had no choice. Under intense international pressure, especially from the United States, they agreed to negotiations. The Round Table Conference in The Hague produced an agreement. The Netherlands would recognize Indonesian independence, though they demanded continued economic privileges and insisted on retaining control of Western New Guinea. On December 27, 1949, the Dutch formally transferred sovereignty to the Republic of Indonesia. The Dutch Empire in Southeast Asia was finished. The end of Dutch colonial rule left bitter legacies. Thousands of Indonesians of mixed Dutch-Indonesian ancestry, the Indos, faced persecution and fled to the Netherlands. Over 100,000 Indonesian colonial soldiers who'd fought for the Dutch also fled, fearing reprisals. In the Netherlands, hundreds of thousands of colonial returnees arrived, traumatized by war and displacement, struggling to rebuild lives in a country many barely knew. The Dutch struggled to come to terms with their colonial history. For decades, many Dutch people remembered the Indies with nostalgia, as a tropical paradise where they lived in comfort. They remembered Indian servants, beautiful plantations, and a leisurely lifestyle. They forgot or minimized the exploitation, the forced labor, the famines, the racial hierarchy. Dutch guilt and Indonesian anger over colonialism poisoned relations for generations. Indonesia itself faced enormous challenges. The revolution had united Indonesians against the Dutch, but governing an independent nation proved far more difficult. Indonesia inherited Dutch colonial borders that encompassed hundreds of ethnic groups, speaking different languages and practicing different religions. The economy was devastated by war. The administrative system was weak. Regional rebellions erupted as different groups competed for power. Sukarno tried to hold Indonesia together through nationalism and charisma, but his presidency became increasingly authoritarian. He suppressed opposition, aligned with communists, and pursued ambitious but economically ruinous policies. In 1965, a failed coup blamed on communists triggered a massive anti-communist purge that killed hundreds of thousands. Sukarno was pushed aside, replaced by General Suharto, who ruled as dictator for over 30 decades. The Netherlands, meanwhile, tried to maintain influence through economic ties and cultural connections. Dutch companies continued operating in Indonesia. The Netherlands offered development aid. They tried to portray the colonial relationship as mutually beneficial, ignoring the fundamental exploitation at its heart.
It wasn't until the 21st century that the Netherlands began seriously examining its colonial past and acknowledging the atrocities committed in the Indies. The destruction of the Dutch Empire was part of a broader collapse of European colonialism after World War II. Britain granted independence to India in 1947, Palestine in 1948, and dozens of African and Asian colonies over the next 2 decades. France fought brutal wars trying to maintain its empire in Indochina and Algeria, ultimately losing both. Portugal clung to its African colonies until the 1970s, finally granting independence after a military coup in Lisbon. By the 1970s, formal European colonial empires had largely disappeared.
Why did this happen? World War II shattered European military and economic power. The moral case for colonialism, the idea that Europeans were bringing civilization to backward peoples, was destroyed by European self-destruction in 2 world wars. The rise of the United States and Soviet Union, both officially anti-colonial, shifted global power away from colonial powers. And colonial peoples themselves, having sacrificed for the war effort and absorbed ideas of democracy and self-determination, demanded independence. The Dutch East Indies case illustrates all these factors. Japanese invasion destroyed Dutch military prestige. The occupation mobilized Indonesian nationalism. World War II weakened the Netherlands economically and militarily. American pressure forced decolonization. And Indonesian revolutionaries proved willing to fight and die for independence, making colonial rule unsustainable. The legacy of Dutch colonialism remains contested. In Indonesia, the revolution is remembered as a heroic struggle for freedom, with Sukarno and other nationalist leaders celebrated as founding fathers. The Dutch period is taught as an era of exploitation and oppression, though some acknowledge Dutch contributions to infrastructure and education. In the Netherlands, colonial history has slowly moved from nostalgia to critical examination, with increasing recognition of colonial violence and exploitation. The economic impact of losing the Indies was significant for the Netherlands. The colony had been a source of wealth for centuries. Losing it forced the Dutch to fundamentally restructure their economy, focusing on European trade and industry rather than colonial extraction. Paradoxically, the loss may have benefited the Netherlands long term. Freed from colonial burdens, the Dutch economy boomed in the post-war decades, becoming one of Europe's most prosperous. For Indonesia, independence brought both liberation and immense challenges. The country has struggled with poverty, corruption, authoritarianism, and separatist movements. But it has also achieved remarkable things, maintaining territorial unity across incredible diversity, becoming Southeast Asia's largest economy, and transitioning to democracy after Suharto's fall in 1998. Indonesia today is a major player in global affairs, a member of the G20, and a nation of over 270 million people charting its own course. The destruction of the Dutch Empire demonstrates that empires, no matter how long established or seemingly secure, can collapse with shocking speed when the circumstances that sustained them change. The Dutch believed their colonial rule was permanent, that Indonesians accepted or even benefited from it. They were wrong on both counts. When Japanese invasion destroyed the myth of European invincibility and World War II transformed the global order, the empire collapsed within a decade. The story also shows the power of nationalism and self-determination. Indonesian nationalists faced enormous obstacles: colonial repression, Japanese occupation, military inferiority against Dutch forces, internal divisions. But their determination to be free, supported by a population that had endured centuries of exploitation, proved unstoppable. Ideas, nationalism, independence, democracy can be more powerful than guns, especially when those ideas resonate with millions of people demanding dignity and freedom. Finally, the Dutch case reveals the difficulty colonizers face in confronting their own history. Empires are built on narratives of superiority and mission, that colonizers are bringing civilization, progress, Christianity, or enlightenment to backward peoples.
Accepting that colonialism was fundamentally about exploitation and violence requires shattering those comforting myths. Many Dutch people, especially colonial returnees, struggled with this. Some still do. In the end, the war that ended the Dutch Empire wasn't just the 3-month Japanese conquest in 1942. It was World War II itself, a global conflict that destroyed the assumptions, power structures, and moral frameworks that had sustained European empires. The Dutch Empire didn't fall because Indonesians defeated the Dutch militarily, though they fought bravely. It fell because the world that had made Dutch colonialism possible ceased to exist. The Netherlands today is a small but prosperous European nation, a founding member of the European Union, committed to democracy and human rights. Indonesia is a rising power in Asia, the world's third-largest democracy, with an economy larger than the Netherlands. Both nations are still working through the complicated legacy of their shared but unequal history. That process of reckoning with colonialism's injustices and violence continues today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this exploration of colonialism's end, make sure to subscribe for more history content. Next time, we'll examine another empire's fall and what it reveals about power, nationalism, and historical change. Until then, remember, history isn't just about the past. It shapes who we are today.